All right, so for this next talk, we have got we're going to talk about Gary Oak restoration. So you can see here on our schedule, you're in room run one currently. We'll go through most of the next hour. And so we'll be watching a video, and then Doug and Kai will discuss any questions you might have after the video ends.
Hi, I'm Doug McCutcheon. I'm a steward with the San Juan County Land Bank in San Juan County, Washington, and we're on San Juan Island today at the Katy Mountain Preserve. This preserve was acquired beginning in 2004, and with the most recent acquisition actually just happened this last month. About 30 acres or so has been targeted for Gary Oak habitat restoration. Covering the south-facing slopes of this property. The property itself is now up to close to 480 acres in size. And this new acquisition, where you'll end up hearing some chainsaws in the background, that basically doubled the amount of Gary Oak habitat that we have here. So very exciting times on the preserve.
Hi, my name is Kai Hoffman-Kroll, and I'm the Forest Health Manager for the San Juan Islands Conservation District. And part of my role in that position is working with the Islands Conservation Corps, which does restoration work throughout San Juan County, and Gary Oak restoration has become a large portion of our activities. And it's a pleasure to be getting to work with Doug and the great team at the Land Bank, both on Orcas, San Juan, and a little bit on Lopez, getting to do this work on such beautiful preserves.
So we were just going to talk a little bit on the background of Gary Oaks and sort of why they're here and why they're important. Of what has been kind of tracked about these trees and these habitat types is they're very old. It's very ancient habitats that go back, oh gosh, 8,000-ish years, something along those lines, looking at pollen records in bogs. And it peaked about 5,000 years ago. And it's kind of believed that that all got established during a time where there was a climate that was a little bit warmer than we're seeing today, which might have some relevance going forward, right? And even after that peak, the oaks in this region have persisted through time.
Yeah, and one of the main techniques that allowed oaks to be within this more conifer-dominant landscape was the regular return interval of fire. And fire was a main tool by the Coast Salish people for cultivating the landscape, and it was an actively managed landscape. This was, especially Gary Oak savannas, were farmland. Both the Gary Oaks themselves, the acorns were used as a staple food for Coast Salish people, but also the understory had a huge variety of both food and medicinal crops that were actively cultivated, and one of those key techniques was fire. And so then we have this situation that since 1910 we've had national policy of fire suppression that has changed this landscape significantly, and a lot of that has been the strong reintroduction of conifers, namely Doug fir, but other conifers too, starting to encroach on those savannas and definitely altering habitat, but also then getting at sort of the Achilles heel of Gary Oaks. The Gary Oaks can survive in most conditions. They can handle a huge variety of soil types. They can handle huge amounts of drought, as well as even saturation periods. In the wintertime, their main Achilles heel is that they need a lot of light. And so this is one of the key issues then that we're dealing with in this modern time is how do you get them access to the light they need?
Yeah, absolutely. And a common term that's being used these days for these landscapes is an ecocultural landscape. It's a landscape that really kind of arose in a close partnership, symbiotic relationship almost between the people who were living here and these lands. And probably starting early on with the introduction of disease that there was no immunity to in the late 1700s. That change started on these landscapes of a change in management, a change of the use of fire, and kind of a slow encroachment of trees. In other areas, there are other stresses, and some of those continue today with development. A lot of the really deep soil, the really rich areas, like if we're looking out into San Juan Valley here, those areas were converted early on for agricultural purposes. Whereas some of these mountain sites, like we're here on Katy Mountain today, have kind of maintained some of their integrity through time, simply because there wasn't as much commercial things to be derived from them, whether logging or mining or more of that intensive agriculture. And so not only did the trees hold on, but portions of this surrounding habitat. That's one of the most biodiverse habitats west of the Cascade Crest. There's a phenomenal amount of plants, insects, mammals, and birds that are all dependent on this really unique ecosystem. And with the island's history, we probably have more of that than much of the surrounding region. So it's of very high importance, not only for its intrinsic beauty, but for those sort of base biological function of this whole region, especially moving forward into a period of warming climate.
And just on that note, that resiliency factors that we talked about with being incredibly drought tolerant, being able to handle a huge variety of soil conditions, and then also just being very slow to grow allows for them to actually handle a lot of varying stresses climatically. And so in many ways, they're seen as one of the more resilient trees that we can be having moving into a changing climate. But again, there's that key piece that we're talking about, is that their Achilles heel, access to sunlight, and Doug firs are incredibly efficient at producing biomass and getting tall really quick. And so that's the relationship that we have to find the balance with. We certainly are supporting a lot of old growth Doug fir habitat in this region as well. But Gary oaks provide a very unique ecosystem type, certainly unique habitat for wildlife, and again play this very key historic role within this landscape that we are trying to both preserve but also see as something to be increasing that strength and presence into the future.
Gary oak habitat isn't just limited here to the San Juan Islands. It actually has a pretty large extent, and we're getting close to the northern extent of its range. You might find it all the way about 100 miles north of us up into British Columbia, kind of on the east side of Vancouver Island, most areas, and some of the little islands there, as well as south of us. Within Washington, there's a couple little patches in the Seattle area, but mostly you'll start seeing it down in the South Sound prairies, Fort Lewis, Olympia, that area. And then it sort of picks up again very strongly through the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And that habitat type extends all the way down into California, and it's really kind of mostly contained to sort of the central kind of north part of California. This particular tree we call morel, after the morel mushroom. And we were lucky to have a dendrochronologist come through here and age some of our trees. And surprisingly, this is the oldest known living Gary oak in the world. It's just a hair under 500 years old, and they pushed the capacity, the known capacity of the species by something like 50 years. So pretty special example right here on San Juan Island. And just knowing that this thing has been here for like close to 500 years, that really starts to give us a sense of the depth of time, how long lived these species are and how long these habitats have been around. The best estimates for oak habitat throughout its entire range is that it's been reduced down to between 3 and 5% is all that remains. So again, we have these just high, diverse, beautiful habitats that are really well adapted for a warming climate. So any of these fragments that are left just are really, really important for us to hold on to and care for.
And so one of the key features that define these landscapes, as we said, was the presence of fire, and that fire was moving through these landscapes. We don't have records at each of these sites, but there are records at a number of locations in San Juan County that look at averages oftentimes at 6-year return intervals of fire, and other locations such as Point Disney on Waldron, fire return intervals of 11 to 13 years. And so that showcases that these were highly managed landscapes, and one of the key species that was actively cultivated with fire was camas, but also a series of lilies, lomatium as a medicinal crop. And the presence of fire had a couple really key attributes for soil fertility. One of those pieces was the presence of ash, which has both high trace mineral content, but also provides a lot of calcium and magnesium for the soil, which allows for for a lot of the transport of nutrients to be able to bond to the different areas of soil particles that hold on to nutrients, called exchange sites. The other key piece of that was the addition of charcoal. Regular fire was producing somewhere around 4 to 6% of the total biomass as charcoal, and that has both a stabilized carbon benefit that helps marry with the bioavailable carbon in the soil, and then increase the mineralization process, which is very similar to how our own digestive systems process the food we eat and then makes it available to our bodies. In the same way, the soil microbial activity requires carbon to be able to process the nutrients in the soil and then make them available to plants. Some of the other benefits that the charcoal provided was high water holding capacity. So as we talked about, some of these south-facing slopes, obviously a lot of direct sun exposure, but that charcoal is then holding on to 4 to 8 times its weight in water. So incredible amount of water holding capacity. And then one of the last pieces is nutrient accumulation. So not only is it helping the flow of nutrients move between soil particles, but also then is retaining, we call that cation exchange capacity, but a way of measuring how much a soil particle can actually hold on to nutrients. And charcoal tends to have a very high rate of cation exchange capacity. So a few of the soil benefits that were provided by charcoal.
So we're standing now over in an area that was a new acquisition on Katy Mountain. This just closed a month ago, and we actually just today started in with the Island Conservation Corps and other land bank staff members on doing some oak release. And we knew there were oaks in here already, but some of the things you might be able to see on your own lands that would give some clues that maybe you've got some oak habitat. One of the first things to look for are oak trees. Probably pretty obvious. And, you know, sometimes you might not see them very readily if there's a lot of Douglas fir growth. Right behind me here, you can see that kind of wider bark and deciduous tree very clearly. So that is you might just clue in that there's something different than the Douglas firs surrounding. Sometimes you don't see the trees. In fact, most often what we find is a couple of old oak leaves on the ground, and they just really pop in that landscape to say, oh, wait, something's different here. Some other clues you may have oak habitat, in addition to oaks, are open-grown Douglas fir, mature trees typically. And those open-grown trees sometimes are referred to as wolf trees. They take on these really fantastical shapes because of not having competition with other trees. They have lower limbs that extend down well onto the base, sometimes down right to ground level, and end up being shorter in stature, but having very complex limb structures that are alive all the way down to the base. Over on the left of me here, you can see this double-trunked tree that's a pretty old Douglas fir that did have lower limbs that were alive for most of its life until real recently. And then the recent change is all of these young, small diameter firs that have come in, probably its progeny, and it's shaded out that lower section of the tree. So I would look at something like that and say, wow, historically, we have that one, and then behind it, maybe 200 feet away is the next one. The structure here used to be much more open than it is today. I might start looking for other understory plants, wildflowers and forbs of different things in the springtime, bunch grasses, things that are more associated with a savanna or grassland rather than a Douglas fir forest. So if you've established that you have Gary oaks on your property and you're interested in conserving them, and if the situation is kind of like what we have here, where a young Douglas fir forest has gotten established around these mature oak trees, really not just jumping in and going crazy and clearing everything all at once is always a good plan. Have a plan, think ahead. What we've really found to work well is doing a methodical approach of making sure we're conserving the tree, doing the cutting we need for that individual tree, but then through the rest of that process is usually doing a little bit slower removal of the remaining trees, being evaluative of how much we need to remove to meet our goals. And a lot of that has to do with the understory. in this particular site, there actually is a little bit of understory. A lot of it's kind of browned out at this point, but there is some native grasses. There's some wildflowers in the springtime. A lot of the sites we work in are so densely forested that there are no plants. And that means usually that we've got to move a little bit more slowly. Typically, we do our removals in fall into the first part of winter. And in this case here, we've come through and we've marked the trees that we want to remove using blue paint. And that's because we're working in kind of with volunteers and various groups. And so we just want to have a lot of clarity about which ones specific trees are for removal. We'll use a different color paint, usually green, to indicate girdling. Once we get through, it's an iterative process for doing the removal of the trees. Often you have to remove trees in order to remove trees. In order to fall these away from the oak, we might have to create an alleyway for the other trees to fall into. So again, a lot of planning goes into that process. Coupled with that is thinking about the understory, and if we really want to be establishing native plants in here, making sure that we have that material on hand as we're getting started in the process. In these systems, most seeds are going to germinate during the fall and early winter as we return into that rainy season. And they may germinate and just be kind of small until the warmth of spring returns, and then those plants start to grow. But what that really means is if we're going to seed, then we need to get this material done and moved before we can get that out on the ground. Similarly, when we're planting plugs, there needs to be sufficient moisture in the ground for us to be able to plant. And so that's something that typically happens a little bit later, sort of maybe early to mid-winter, that we'll be getting out and planting out things into these habitats. So a lot of thought about timing and the activities you're going to do from a holistic approach. So as we're looking over at this oak, this was kind of a fun one, and this was not the first one that this happened with, where we didn't find this tree during our initial surveys, which seems amazing looking at it now. But it was actually somebody sneaking away for a pee break who was working on an adjacent site who said, "Hey, are you guys going to do any work around that oak up there?" And we said, "What oak?" And yeah, came up and found this other tree, and there was so much young Douglas fir in here that you couldn't see this tree. If you actually even look today where the live canopy is on this tree, it's probably at least 20, 25 feet up. And so that was above those young trees, enough that they could, those leaves and limbs could stay alive, where it lost all of these other lower limbs. So a lot of these trees are in that shape where they're hanging on just with the upper part of the canopy, and they've lost, in some cases 50, 60, 75% of the kind of living parts of the tree.
So this is kind of an example of like a before and after situation for why we're doing this restoration. So this big, magnificent, beautiful oak that is unfortunately now dead was shaded out by all of these Douglas fir saplings that kind of infilled. And back when this land was stewarded by indigenous people, the way that this would have been kept clear is with regular burns. So these saplings actually wouldn't have been allowed to grow up into, this age where they could shade out this oak. And this oak unfortunately died slowly over a period of like 15 years. These conifers just grow super, super quickly, and over a period of 15 years, they ended up growing above the canopy and shading out the oak, and then it died. But notice how, this big Douglas fir and that big oak and some bigger trees around are so spaced out. It's kind of this open woodland structure where there was a lot of light. Trees were very, very spaced out, and all of these saplings that kind of infilled over the time that fire has been suppressed in the islands are changing this forest structure quite a lot. So now there's quite a bit of shade. It's turning more into a closed canopy forest. And that in itself is, a great ecosystem type, but unfortunately it's not a very resilient ecosystem type for the way that our climate is progressing. So that's why we're doing this restoration, is because the oaks are super resilient to drought, and that structure is going to be favored in times that are coming. And we want to promote the resiliency of these ecosystems and hopefully reintroduce the type of land management relationships that these ecosystems thrived with, which is regular fire and regular interaction with people. Because ultimately, on a broader scale, climate change is kind of the result of a culture of land private, or policies of land privatization that produced a culture of land neglect. So we want to not only restore this landscape, but restore the relationships that sustain this landscape, because it is very high contact and interrelated with humans.
This was the first area that we worked on as a restoration site, and was really focused on saving these trees. And we didn't know the age of the tree at that point in time. Only later, 10 years later, we learned how old the tree was. But when we started in here, this was just all like Douglas fir on like 2 foot on center. Like you couldn't walk through it. You couldn't even honestly, we didn't even know this tree was here. It was just walking through these really dense woods where we started seeing some oak leaves and saying, how did this get here? Where's this tree? But seeing it now that after we did this release of cutting all these firs and we've caged some of these oaks, we're getting some young trees that are coming in, trying to get some new Douglas fir recruitment. And the shrubs is what I'm also noticing today. These ocean spray and snowberry that are getting established. We've got some noxious weed issues here, some blackberry, some thistle. I guess that what kind of brings home to me is that, it was almost 20 years ago that we did the canopy release in here. And as you were talking about fire with that regimes of frequent low intensity fire, this would have burned in those old systems 3 times probably, at least in that period, which would have suppressed some of these shrubs and those trees that are sort of being recruited. So part of this whole process is it's not a one and done. We're just starting into this whole new system of how do we kind of care for and manage these sites.
Yeah.
So we're looking at right here is this little oak seedling that's out here in the open, unprotected. And if we were to search around here, we'd find dozens of these. I mean, this tree has been here, again, for 500 years, dropping acorns, and its progeny are around quite a bit. You notice how shrubby and small this one is. As we came in here, we've caged a lot of the trees, but not all of them. And if we take a look just upslope here at one in a cage, this is really to reduce herbivory by deer. And when this was caged in, this is great. This was cage number 1 in 2005. So we're looking at 17 years ago. This looked like that. And in that amount of time, we've done some pruning and really the only care that it's had, other some pruning to encourage vertical growth, was just having the cage on it. And so this has been a really significant thing in order for us to get some more oak recruitment. Across this site of the trees that were dated, the youngest tree that we had was about 200 years old. The youngest mature tree we had was about 200 years old. So we're lacking recruitment over the last 200 years for new generation of Gary oaks. Now we have over 200 that are caged, and a lot more like this little one you saw down here that are not protected as yet.
So here we have a great example of an oak branch, and there's some elements of this that are really important for understanding how oaks have been fire adapted in these ecosystems. So you see this terminal bud, which is this large fat bud up front, and that obviously is what's going to send the main branch over the next couple seasons. And then you have these lateral buds that are on the side here that obviously are sending side branches, but then underneath of those are what's called epicormic buds, and those are dormant. And there's actually a hormone that is running through the plant that is keeping those epicormic buds dormant. And then when a fire moves through the landscape and it experiences heat, those epicormic buds lose that hormone and then get the signal to branch out. And so you can have this whole area top kill, but then again, those epicormic buds are hiding underneath these other buds and underneath the bark here, and then are insulated from the fire. And so then it has this inherent regeneration strategy that this whole branch can die off, but then all these buds, latent buds, are then able to pop out the next year. The other piece about that is that these buds also have, if you were to look inside and cut them open, there's all these areas of space between the layers that serve as insulation, so that even these terminal buds and lateral buds have a self-insulating phenomenon for fire. So again, just to sort of illustrate that this bud, of course, is represented throughout this whole small oak tree, and just a part of how it was able to handle fire on these regular return intervals without killing the tree itself, sometimes killing some of these branches, but then regenerating at a very quick and natural rate.
This right here is a pile that was made probably about a year ago and let to cure and dry. So essentially we're in an ecosystem that used to be a lot more open and have a lot more light, and there's been a lot of infill of encroaching Douglas fir. So we're trying to restore this area to be more of a savanna woodland structure so that the Gary oaks can survive in the full light that they need, and also to stimulate the growth of some native plants that are very associated with Gary oak savannas and also need full light. So after cutting a tree down, kind of what we would do to process that tree is turn the trunk or stem material into kind of mimicking a nurse log, so that it would decompose and enrich the soil that way. But with all of the branch material, we make them into these burn piles. And the reason that we do that is because fire used to be a very incorporated part of this landscape, especially when indigenous people lived in the islands. They would use fire as a management tactic for their agriculture, to keep these savannas nice and open and to stimulate the growth of very fire-dependent native plants. So a lot of the food plants that grow in these ecosystems are dependent on fire. When a fire comes through and burns the tops of the plant, all the energy of the plant goes back into the roots, which often were these fleshy edible bulbs that would get bigger, with the disturbance of the fire. And fire also stimulates the growth of new oak branches and keeps the oaks nice and healthy. Acorns are a source of food for First Nations and also for a lot of native birds and animals to this area. So very important to have fire as a part of this landscape. And because we can't do landscape burning at the scale that indigenous people used to, we do pile burning instead, just to at least introduce little pockets of biochar into the system. And so the way that we construct these piles are kind of in a nice tight formation so that all of the woody material burns at a consistent rate. You don't want any of this to go out into ash or to burn too hot. So typically the woody material we use is branch material or stem material that's less than 3 inches in diameter. And we kind of build them in a 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot tall, like nice tight pile, so that when this is lit on fire, it's all gonna burn consistently. So some of the things that we look for in placing a burn pile are nice open areas where there isn't any fire risk of catching dead branches on fire or anything with neighboring trees. But also you want to look around and make sure that there's no cut stumps or anything. If you build a pile and set it on fire on top of a stump, the fire could actually go into the root system. Same with if you build a pile on top of a root that's just under the shallow surface of the soil. And that can sterilize the soil and make the fire get out of control and become a dangerous situation. So this location was chosen because it's in a nice open area, and it's also on this rocky bald. And a lot of the plants that were associated with this ecosystem grew out of these rocky balds. So it makes sense to enrich the soil on the spot that's going to receive the most sunlight, where those plants are likely to want to return. It's also a game of timing. You want to make sure there's enough moisture in the landscape that this isn't just going to torch and all turn to ash and sterilize the soil. So we're looking at like late fall and late spring times where it's not like completely saturated with water in wintertime, like moisture levels, but it's also not so dry that it's just going to light up and be out of control. So after constructing a pile like this, we would also take a sheet of wax paper and kind of place it about a quarter into the pile. So you just like lift up this brush and put a sheet of wax paper right there, and that helps to reduce the emissions of these piles once they're burned. A recent study was done showing that papering piles reduces the emissions by like up to 6 times piles that aren't papered. So just trying to keep our impact relatively low. And once this burns down to a level of charcoal, we usually come in with tanks of water that have squirt guns, and we start spraying the fire out and have these long metal rakes, and we'll just rake the charcoal out and spread it around until the fire's put out. And your end result is something like this. So this was a burn pile that was burned and put out kind of a while ago. So a lot of this charcoal is starting to integrate into the soil already, which is what we want. But this is kind of what we're looking for. This beautiful, very light, very water retaining charcoal that isn't ashy. So charcoal has all sorts of studied benefits for soil, including retaining up to six times its weight in water and facilitating nutrient transfer into plants and sequestering carbon and all of that good climate change mitigating stuff.
So we've talked a lot about burning as an important part of this whole puzzle of doing these restoration projects. And keeping in mind that we are a local government, we're San Juan County government, we might be in a little bit different position than someone who's doing this as a private landowner. And the scale really matters as well. So I think the first thing I'll say right out of the gate is check with your local jurisdiction, whoever where you're based is responsible for fires and burn permits and that sort of thing. It's going to vary a lot at the local level. If you're doing a very small scale and you're just doing one or two of these piles in your backyard, sort of a level, it's probably going to be that local department. But technically, for sort of forestry type operations in Washington State, that's something that's permitted at the state level through the State Department of Natural Resources. And so that's where we transitioned. When we started these projects and we were working just on one or two and we had a couple of burn piles, we were permitting through the county level. But we've switched, and we are now been working with the Department of Natural Resources to primarily do our permitting there. We do, though, still do a lot of communication with the local county fire departments, which there are different districts on each of the islands out here. It's a pretty complicated landscape. But we want to make sure that they know when we're burning. We get our permits, but we also check in so that anybody calling 911 or anything they're gonna have the information about what's going on and what we're doing, the volume, all of that sort of basic information.
So I mentioned that with the downed trees, after we process all the branches into burn piles, we make the stem material into these aggregated nurse logs. So this is an example of what that means. When a tree falls in the forest, it decomposes and becomes a nutrient source for the soil and for other trees and other plants to grow out of it. So this is kind of mimicking like a big downed tree, like if an old growth tree fell. So yeah, just to not leave all the stem material scattered in these bald areas, because we do want to leave those open for other plants to grow instead of having a lot of woody debris just aggregated. So, or not aggregated. So we aggregate it so that it all can kind of decompose. And I'm told that this particular nurse log was built on top of a log that was downed and decomposing already. So that'll just like speed up the process.
We're in an area here where probably just last year or the year before, some of these young Doug firs were removed. And a really important process in here, the Gary oaks are really important, but as part of our restoration process, we're also really trying to get that native understory established. We went as far as starting our own native plant nursery, the Salish Seeds Nursery. And so in my hand here, I've got a couple of seed pods from some camas that was probably planted out up here by us. It might have been naturally occurring. As plugs or just as seed. Didn't actually get any, look like I just got one little seed out of all that, or two little seeds. And in addition to that, there's some plugs that have been planted here that are some fescue. And I happen to have with me one of these plugs from the nursery today. And, most people kind of think about grass, they think about their lawns at home, And that's really kind of a spreading mat forming grass that becomes really homogeneous. Versus most of the native grasses in these sites are bunch grasses, so they kind of grow as little individual plants. And what's really key characteristic of that is these bunches leave space, that interstitial space in between, that allow space for other plants to come up, including things like this camas and shooting star and just dozens of other wildflowers. So we explored a little bit about determining whether you might have oak habitat, a little bit of an approach of how you might go through that removal of the Douglas fir. But we want to turn our attention down here a little bit to the understory. And similar to what we were discussing before, planning for all of this is just so important. And there's, within the planning, I guess there's 3 elements that would be really probably the most critical things. The first thing is have plant materials. If you're going to work on those understory plants, having materials to go in the ground is really important. You might be able to source those through a local nursery that specializes in native plants, and ask around for resources. Your local conservation district or other conservation programs might be able to help direct you to where you might be able to find some of those resources. So if you kind of know how much area you are working in and you know the kind of plants you want to use, you have those on hand, the next element you really want to do is site preparation. So when we're preparing sites for seeding, assuming we've gone through and removed trees and we don't have a whole lot of understory, is typically where we're trying to get most plants established, we'll do a little bit of work. I didn't have a great spot to demonstrate this, so I'm just kind of choosing one little place here below this Douglas fir that's going to be coming out later, where I have an almost bare earth, but also all of these limbs and things. So what we would probably do is do some work to clear out these limbs, probably choosing to use a rake rather than my feet. And then just a very light raking of this duffy material that's needles and decomposing needles and things to expose just a little bit of the mineral soil, the bare soil there. So the seeds are not going to germinate unless they get in contact with soil. So the last thing that's really important with that process is in timing. And as I mentioned before, the timing for planting and things, seeding, ideally you want to seed in fall, and usually early fall, September or October is really great. You can do with some species later in the year, but get ahead of the game and try and have that ready to go in September or October. And then planting. For planting plugs, we're looking a little bit later in the year into fall. November is often kind of an ideal month, sometimes into December. But you want to get that when there's enough soil moisture to be able to easily plant and for those plants to be able to kind of get rooted in before, a higher potential of hard freezes and things later in the year. So I have with me here just a couple of little examples. These are grown at the Salish Seeds Nursery, a joint project of the San Juan County Land Bank and the San Juan Preservation Trust. And here's a little fescue and a field chickweed, native wildflower. And you can see that these are growing in the same little plots, these little plugs. And there's an excellent tool, which I didn't bring with me today. It's called a dibble. That basically is a metal tool that matches this exact profile. And the ground's too hard and dry right now to demonstrate very well anyhow. But you would use that tool to make this nice little hole in the soil. And then you can squish the sides of these little containers, tap them, and look at that, beautiful. Out comes your little plug. You can see the roots in there. And sometimes I might loosen these just a little bit before I put them into that pre-made hole with the dibble. Just gonna put that one back, take it back to the nursery. And then if you are lucky enough to be able to get some seed of various species, I think we have about 25 species that we are growing at the nursery that we're then collecting seed from to plant out. And in this case, I have an example of jars that have 2 different things in here. Great camas on the left there, and spring gold on the right. 2 very different looking seeds, and they're gorgeous. I love the seeds. And some of the seeds are actually, quite small. And so both as a matter to be able to kind of spread that seed more easily and equally for those small ones, we'll often mix, say with like almost a 1-to-1 with either vermiculite or sand will also work with the seeds. And the other added benefit to that, you see those seeds are mixed in there, is when we're going and doing the seeding, it's a lot easier to see where we've spread the seeds. Typically, we just do this by hand rather than using a seed spreader. We've tried that in the past, and with just the varying sizes of the seeds and things, it seems like we get a lot better product doing this by hand. We'll work over an area, and we'll go from one direction and cover all the way across. And then we'll try to go back the other way, 90 degrees, and come back and do some more seeding, spreading from the other direction. And if you imagine doing this over a much larger area, that vermiculite really just pops. You can see where you've gone and what areas might be heavier and what areas might be lighter, and give you a chance to add or move some seed around. If you're at home and you're doing this and you have a little bit more access, you can do some mulching, and that can be beneficial. Straw, not hay. You don't want to get that hay seed in there. Can be a good mulch, or maybe some very thin bit of soil. You don't want to rake it in. As you start to rake, you start into the soil more, you really start getting in where you might be sowing a lot of weed seed and things. You want to be really delicate with any raking you do for your site prep as well. So yeah, typically we'll just plant these things out, and then they're on their own. We don't come back and do any watering, or we do a little bit of monitoring just to see how things have gone so we can adjust our practices over time. But for the most part, they're on their own out in these natural areas. At home, if it's a real dry spring, doing a little bit of watering, certainly coming in and weeding undesirable grasses or weed species out is really helpful. Really depends on the scale that you're working in and what your goals are. Thanks so much for joining us here. I just wanted to kind of cap this off with a couple of thoughts. And again, that these ecosystems, these scary oak ecosystems, they've been around for thousands of years. And in that close relationship with people, that cultural portion is such an important part of these areas. And their resiliency of just needing a little bit of a nudge, a little help from all of us to keep persisting couldn't be more clear. And we're standing here right now by this really cool oak tree, or is it trees? Maybe it's plural now. But these actually got blown over at some point in time. Most likely kind of got crowded out by firs on a little weekend, and then a windstorm toppled them. And yet for close to a century, they've been persisting. They've gotten enough light that even though they lost more than half of their root system and everything shifted and changed by getting blown over, here they are. So that little bit of help is fantastic. If you would like to get a hold of me with San Juan County Land Bank, my name's Doug McCutcheon, or Kai Hoffman-Kroll with the San Juan Islands Conservation District. We're happy to be resources. We're really grateful to WSU Extension, North Sound Extension for this opportunity to share our passion and love for these habitats. And yeah, thank you for being interested, and I hope you find a way to get engaged in your local oak ecosystems or whatever else you might have in your part of the state.
All right. So I see that there has been a lot of activity going on in the chat already. So perhaps Kai and Doug have already been responding to some of these, but I'm just gonna scroll up to the top and start to ask through things that have not been answered. And Doug or Kai, if you have anything to add straight off, feel free to jump in while I'm doing a bit of scrolling here.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rebecca. I think there's been a lot of interest in how to get some of these ecosystems established. That's really exciting because of course that's one of the goals, both preserving existing Gary oak habitat, but also expanding some of that habitat in areas. And so people have been asking some of the, a lot of this has already been answered, but I think site prep is really a key issue. And that early stages of competition is really something to be examining. And so people were talking about, how much removal to be doing of some understory species. And because oaks grow so slowly, definitely looking at reducing some of that competition for those first years is really key. People mentioned salal, and salal will definitely outcompete a Gary oak planting or germinated acorn. So really thinking about preparing that site, removing some of the understory, caging it, because certainly deer will be browsing on those oaks. And then once that oak can get more established, then obviously it can withstand a lot more pressure. But of course, as we're talking about with some of the fir encroachment, there's ongoing management that's needed to be keeping those oaks into a more open and savanna structure.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm just gonna ask a couple of these questions that doesn't look like they got answered, but definitely let me know if we're kind of repeating some stuff. So one that I'm noticing, Judy asked, we have several areas in Poulsbo's Fish Park that might be good areas for oak establishment. Any tips on establishing oaks?
I think Kai, and hi, Rebecca, thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
I think Kai was really answered some of that about site prep and site selection. So again, these are really long-lived trees, and sometimes in sort of park settings and city settings, we tend to be sort of not thinking about the long game. And so there's some patience maybe involved with these oaks getting established, and then kind of making sure that you're choosing an area that may be able to persist in the long run. I know of sites in Vancouver Island where people have been successful in trying to get oaks used as landscaping plants along streets and in parks and things. But they really struggled because of what I mentioned about the shape of the trees, that they tend to branch out at lower levels, and doesn't give that kind of classic English garden park kind of appearance. And so the advice that I've heard and passing on here is to kind of have that in mind going in, and train those trees to have a little bit more vertical growth. If it's a street side kind of a space, you have to accommodate vehicles driving by, for instance. But really it's site selection, site prep are just really critical. Outside of that, if there's water and light and good soil, these oaks, they'll do great. They really can persist in so many different locations. So.
Great. Yeah, it looks like you guys were very efficient on answering these questions, which I really appreciate. So I and definitely folks, participants who are in attendance, feel free to keep asking other questions if you have any. But I thought for Doug and Kai, I would just add or ask a little bit of a follow-up. There was the question about blackberries and how do you use herbicide, or how does removal work? And I was curious with the techniques that you mentioned, maybe going into more detail about how many years it takes or how successful it's been with the different techniques, and maybe just any further insights you might have to offer.
Oh, okay. So for that specifically to the blackberry question.
Yeah.
So it really depends on the setting. Again, of where the blackberry is and how established it is. I find that, really well established, like large hedges, they're a lot of work, but often it seems like it's a little bit easier to control them. And that might just be that they have their sort of ratio of root resources to plant size is as soon as you remove all of that biomass and you grub out the roots, there's just not as much energy there as there is in kind of smaller dispersed individual plants. That said, I tend to work in a strategy of starting from dispersed areas back into areas of concentration. I think it varies a little bit, but if you can mow, maybe 2 to 3 times a year and grub out the main root wads, it seems like about 90% or better of blackberry infestations we're able to deal with over the course of, maybe 2 to 3 year time window. In areas where we have a lot of blackberry, there's spots where we've been battling it for, my organization anyways, is for more than 30 years. So it varies a lot.
Yeah.
And just one small note on blackberries is that, yeah, oftentimes, when you look at sort of the whole mess of it all, it can feel really overwhelming to deal with. But oftentimes, either a weed whacker with a blade or actually oftentimes larger restoration crews utilize chainsaws to get that material down low. And then once you start seeing the crowns start to have that regrowth, then you're just digging out and grubbing out those crowns. So, I think it's again helpful to see it as sort of incremental stages. Don't think you need to get it all out at once, but getting the material low, and then again, it's much more non-intimidating when you just are grubbing out crowns rather than the whole thing.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and I appreciate you guys mentioning girdling and kind of the importance of that. That was something we did discuss in the field, and unfortunately there were some things that got cut for time, so we might need a director's cut of the information. All right, are there any other last thoughts? We've got 2 more minutes until we need to transition, so are there any last questions? Or Doug or Kai, if you had any last thoughts, feel free to add those in.
Well, I just saw that last comment from Rhonda Larson Kramer about an oak getting cut down because of following a snow ice event. It lost a large branch. And I just wanted to say that's actually one of the really kind of key features of Gary oaks. One of the things that makes them such a great kind of individual part of that habitat is they tend to lose limbs for whether it's a snow event or just sort of the growth patterns over time. And often those limb losses result in hollow cavities that create opportunities for fungi to get established. All kinds of insects utilize them, things like the Purpurtius dusky-winged butterfly, that's an oak obligate species. And then also hollow cavities create really excellent nesting habitat. So that's just like, it's one of those things that we look at it kind of from an aesthetic thing, or that it's problematic that there might be these things in there, but it's actually that structural diversity that is so amazing about these trees. One feature, anyways.
That was a great answer, Doug. And just one last piece is that it's actually a series of bird species that will eat or sort of drink oak sap as a nutrient source. So this periodic breaking of branches actually is part of food sources for wildlife. In Europe, they're actually doing arborist projects to mimic natural disturbance agents, where they actually are breaking off branches in systematic ways. So there's actually overt intention around breaking these branches.
All right, it looks like there's one last question from Rhonda. Can you repeat why you go slowly when thinning a dense fir stand, and why not clear it all at once?
Sure. My experience of that in those very first ones we went in and just took everything out all at once, and then we were fighting just a half acre of thistle and non-native grasses, and it creates this really large disturbance all at once. You're bringing in light, you're moving a whole lot of material, doing ground disturbance, and there's not really anything established there when it's really dense. There's no understory. And we found as doing the removal slowly, we do less overall disturbance, and we try to get in and start seeding and planting native plants as early as possible to get that establishment. And we found it, to be very, very successful in getting within the resulting mosaic after you do the removal of having more native plant establishment in that mosaic. I would say in a lot of the spots that we're working, that dense stands of fir have been a 3 to 5 year sort of timeline for removal. Around the oaks, you saw the oak that Julie was by that was a dead one. We are moved much more quickly around the oak trees as we're moving into a new area because of their susceptibility of getting shaded out and whatnot. So those areas we may move a little bit more quickly and have to deal with the consequences in the understory a bit, but we want those legacy old growth trees to persist in the landscape.
Yeah, and just a few other pieces on that is, especially in sort of mixed conifer oak stands, even if they're heavily congested, those trees have established all in unison. And so then if you remove a significant portion, such as like 50% of the total stem count, well, or I should maybe say biomass, then the remaining trees are more susceptible to wind throw, just because their strength and stability has been formed in partnership with those other trees. So even though their long-term health is going to be improved by the reduction of competition, again, sort of in the next 3 to 5 years, they're going to be more susceptible to wind throw. So that slower release is going to allow for them to firm up, get their root systems reestablished with this new concentration of trees, and then coming in that 5 to 10 year period will allow then for that next stage of thinning. And then just as we mentioned in the chat, and I think as Doug was just articulating really well, when we think about disturbance agents in forests, we oftentimes think about fire and we think about wind, but sudden access to light is its own disturbance agent. And so having that occur in a more slow pattern, that if these ecosystems were regularly burning, which again, a lot of these research papers illustrate a regular return interval of 6 to 15 years for fire, in that setting, you're having a pretty light amount of influence of reintroduction of light after these fires are occurring. So if you have a stand that's had fir growth for 50 to 70 to 100 years, suddenly, a dramatic reduction of biomass is going to have a much more significant shock to the system. And as Doug was mentioning, you can have a lot of exotic seed bank already established that then can take advantage of that more significant light disturbance. So for all the reasons that he mentioned, beneficial to kind of go slower, let the ecosystem sort of reestablish and find balance with this change, and then continue that slow intervention over 5, 10, 15 year period.
Great. All right. Well, Doug and Kai, thank you so much for your time today and your time that you took to make the video as well.